Rose knew for a fact that the scientific director was being recharged with no more than 3 hours of sleep a night, though he'd ordered Oppenheimer not to be among those who stayed at the lab all through the night. Being at home didn't ensure sleep. It had become harder to keep him away from Ground Zero, to keep the scrawny, star-splitting leader away from the unstable place that just might blow up unpredictably at any time. Oppie's loneliness was not for women, not even for his wife, nor for the camaraderie of his peers. Now that he was trading in cosmic commodities on such a grand scale, he was, he thought, perhaps only for a god to relieve him of such ultimate power. He would never give up, even to the most modest respite. No nappings, blackings, steeping in baths. No one was working less than 10 to 18-hour days, although Hitler had already surrendered. In Europe, the war had ended. Boundaries of sovereignty had already been rearranged, and the Russians were likely to begin work on a bomb. The base camp now was guarded, with military police dispatched from the hill, though the jewel of all weapons had not yet arrived. If Oppie's spindly body was being so ferociously defended, then the bomb must be too. The babble in the lab became ever more undecipherable, even as more of the men were drafted to work at the base camp. Each day, another number of empty lab stools was added to the body count of those reassigned to the Trinity site. Living with them in the barracks were newcomers to the project, specializing in measurement or explosives, safety or security. Could the atmosphere itself be exploded? If so, the universe would then disappear. What do you bet? Will we open our eyes to the sky tomorrow? Some of the scientists had started a betting pool, a buck a bet. How many tons of dynamite would the explosion equal? Such numbers might not exist even in the unused portions of their spacious brains. Even the usually serious Robbie participated in the pool, putting his money on 20,000 tons. I'm about as sure of this, he began with confidence, as I am of the locked-in-air stank of uncertainty. On the evening of July 11th, back in Los Alamos, Oppie walked home and then, "Goodbye, my kitty," he said, without addressing the possibility that he might never see her again. And yet she inferred the scale of his goodbye. "Here, keep this with you," she said, and pressed a four-leafed clover into his palm. "Don't lose it." What more did she mean? "I'll get word to you," he vowed, unless the radioactive message itself reached her first. If he said that she could change the sheets, he told her, she would know that the test had been successful. The device was ready, the men were ready, the scientists, the technicians, Oppie himself and Groves. Groves was ready, the army, the president was ready in the Oval Office, and the birds, scattering frantically, were ready, the earth ready to die, the air ready to be tainted, the original sin ready to be topped. Oppenheimer leaned over the gadget, poised in its place at the top of the tower. If he had turned and squinted, the earthen huts clustered a safe distance from the tower would have looked like a primitive city, the rows of holes in the mountainside at Bandelier. The rain would rain, then stop, then rain again. By dawn, hopeful, desperate, they scheduled the go-ahead, leaving less than an hour for the big bomb to be armed and for all of the instruments to be gotten ready, for the eyes of the cameras to be cleaned and focused so they could document the revolution that even its creators could, at best, lamely imagine. Finally, the hysteria of billions of atoms inside the huge capsule could not be contained. The spectators who had thought their way to this final outcome could see nothing, know nothing else, certainly not any regrets that might occur to them later. Everyone around was warned to lie on his belly, even those wearing suits. "Look away, look away!" They covered their eyes with their forearms. A noise unlike any before it cracked open the earth. A column of dragon's breath ascended, mixing earth with air and fire, and the spent rain, the hesitant rain, and the light, the heat. The explosion thundered hundreds of miles away, ricocheting off the rocks, back and forth as smoke and cloud roiled the sky. Miles away, they could see it. Through slices of filtering glass they'd been sternly instructed to place in front of their eyes. 700, some of them inside the huts, watching the world change. Window panes rattled in their frames, and the sky was inflamed with mechanical rage as the cloud of smoke and fire levitated up, away into space. Was this then what prayers looked like? What ambition felt like? A need to be so much more in order finally to become humble. On a ranch southwest of the Trinity site, cattle-backed burns colored the fur of the herd pure white, and logic failed mightily. Early up, the ranch wife said to her husband, "Look, the sun is rising in the west." What do you mean? He'd seen it too, but wanted her to be the one to say it. New phenomena of light and color required new words to be created if anyone was ever to speak of that morning when the mountains trembled and the sun seemed to have touched down in the desert. Even a new vocabulary of time was needed to describe the everlasting moment that was over in a fraction of a second. Oppie stood beside Frank, wondrous and relieved and horrified, disgraced. "It works," he mumbled, the two words humming around inside his mouth like a fly. Then, from a memory stash of verse surfaced a line that he said aloud, his so small voice consumed by the predatory rumble that had shaken through all the strata of rock. "I have become death, destroyer of worlds." And 20 miles away, the scientists and technical witnesses were still seeing repetitions of that raging flash of light, an overload of impressions not absorbed by the senses, so even the blind could have perceived that merciless light, the heat. Intense heat could be felt 5 miles away. And just then the mountains appeared tiny, the desert no more than a quilt patch of land. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. So near a star would have been thought an apparition, but this kindled energy seared through space with tangible speed. The many measuring instruments were suddenly in unison animated, busy giving numbers to the lethal atmosphere now tinted purple with the unreal light of a voice soaking through the barrier of matter, though not a voice that any of them could understand, except perhaps Oppie, who squinted his eyes and listened past the many languages he'd mastered to a universal undertone, an eerie spiritual beckoning. The genie rose and rose higher, wider, billowing smoke and dirt, a servant become an overlord, controlling the next era of the century. As of now, I am a different person. In suits, in cowboy boots, in jeans, at desks, in huts, they were all finally freed from the months of imprisonment. They could assume their names again, claim street numbers for themselves. Oppie dropped the dull ember of his cigarette. He flexed his fingers and stared incredulously at them, then brought his palms together. "I have blood on my hands." He wrung his hands as if cleansing them. "The physicists have known sin," Oppie said, "and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose." Had he, after all, contributed to the rescue of Western civilization? Could he and his scientists have influenced the way war was spoken of? Or was their greatest impact that green, glassy residue where the unbearable brightness compressed history into a broken brittle of small, souvenir-sized pieces? Oppie understood then what he hadn't learned from the years of figures on paper and impromptu conferences in the lab. Whether the sheets were changed or not changed, whether the men watched or looked away, if they calculated the rate of expansion correctly, seemed irrelevant now when even death itself was no longer a standard for failure. And that visionary aim of cooperation among nations, the shared control of nuclear technology, dismissed and ridiculed until some years later, when Oppenheimer was asked by Congress how that ideal might be approached. "It's too late now," he said. "It should have happened the day after